Hi, I am Michael Beck, an AWS Enterprise Support Manager based out of San Francisco, California, and welcome to AWS Supports You, where we provide best practices and troubleshooting tips from AWS Support. Joining me today is Rob Higuerita from AWS Support. Can you give us an introduction, Rob?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. My name is Rob Higuerita, and I'm an enterprise support lead / technical account manager located in Austin, Texas. I'm a member of our Microsoft technical field community here, so I spend a lot of time engaging with customers on their Microsoft technologies, and happy to talk to you today.
All right, thanks, Rob. So today we will be introducing you to how you can extend or migrate your Active Directory to AWS. We'll be specifically talking about Active Directory offerings that AWS has and how it integrates with other AWS services. But before we get into the details, a quick note to the attendees online. Feel free to use the chat window located to your right to pose any thoughts or questions which you might have throughout the episode. We really look forward to hearing from you, and we might even be able to answer a few of your questions live online. So Rob, can you go ahead and walk us through what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And we're going to be covering, of course, how you can extend or migrate Active Directory to AWS. We're going to go over a few different options that also kind of go with this, whether it be to actually migrate or, like it says, just to extend and use your current infrastructure. The reason why we're going to cover kind of a combination is because there's three major usage patterns that tend to happen for customers using Active Directory in AWS. One of it's just using native AWS Microsoft Managed AD. Using Active Directory on an Amazon Elastic Compute cloud instance, just self-managing it themselves, whether it's just that it's isolated in AWS or it's extended to their on-premise, or just using Active Directory on-premise to an external location, connecting to it via VPN or Direct Connect. In some cases, we can see that we have many customers that will actually have a combination of all three patterns, where they may have managed AD that's leveraging connectivity back to on-premise through different options. And so we're going to kind of try and cover a variety of those today so we can help you to kind of pick maybe which one's the right path for you as you're looking into your AWS cloud journey. We're going to start specifically first talking about AWS Managed Active Directory. And that is going to be our fully managed Active Directory offering that we have. And it's going to allow you to easily migrate your directory-dependent workloads leveraging a managed service. So you can worry about just the application and how it works and not necessarily the domain controllers and such behind it. This is also going to allow you to leverage things like SSO integration, not only to the console, but with your applications as well that support Active Directory natively as they are. And in the background, it uses actual Microsoft AD there as well. And so a few key components that support that, of course, is that, again, it's actual Microsoft AD in the background. This allows you to establish trust, so you can do a one-way or two-way trust back to your on-premise organization or to an external resource. Allows you to integrate with different services and stuff like that. Since it supports trust, you need like Azure AD Connect and stuff as well. It's going to have group policy support. So the same group policies that maybe you're using right now on your on-premise Active Directory, you could import in and leverage those through the same things like restrict administrator groups or push a desktop background, right? That's uniform across your organization. If you're using Amazon Workspaces with Managed AD, you can use it to, push things to desktops that you would normally have for your actual Amazon Workspaces users. As well as letting you leverage things like seamless domain join. If you're not familiar with that, we'll kind of see what it looks like a little bit in the console later. But it's what's going to allow you to basically spin up a EC2 instance into your Active Directory environment when you launch it. So you don't have to worry about doing that after the fact. Managed Microsoft AD also allows you to support multiple accounts and VPCs. And this way you can deploy your AD environment and share it throughout your organization rather than having to have a AD environment located in one account and have it in another account such as well. One of the key features of it, of course, being that it's AWS managed infrastructure. And as we deploy our services, we want to make sure they're highly available. So we have them deployed in multiple AZs, and it takes daily snapshots as well in order to help you make sure that you have some availability to your Active Directory. We'll take, again, a look at that in the console a little bit later when we go to deploy, kind of how it makes you leverage multiple subnets and stuff in AZs in order to implement it. Another key component that customers, of course, want to understand is compliance standards when they go into looking at a service. And so as you can see here, we have a long list. I won't read through all of them for you, but you can see that we've got some DoD standards. We've got HIPAA on there, PCI compliance. And we're going to drop a link into the chat as well that's going to cover some other services in scope information about leveraging Microsoft Managed AD. There may be some other things that you have to do to configure on the actual environment once it's deployed to make sure that you're within compliance. So make sure to look at that and also look at some of the documentation that we provide on our Managed AD offering. So that way you can look to make sure you fit into your compliance needs. Compliance is almost always important for large enterprise organizations. Even smaller organizations need to make sure they're compliant as well, especially in those PCI areas. And so we have some, different things that are going to be there on the compliance side, but we also have some use case examples that are going to be here as far as giving you the ability to have that kind of skim provisioning of users. That way you've got that system for cross-domain ID management, if you're not used to what skim is, to allow you to basically create that user and have kind of one location into your workflow of where you're going to create that. This is going to allow you to centrally manage identity. So instead of having to have on-premise AD and AD on Amazon EC2 of users, IAM users, you can leverage this Microsoft Managed AD to then implement access into like your AWS console and stuff that we'll take a look at a little bit later as well. This is really just going to allow you to centralize management and access into your accounts and into some different services and still be able to take advantage of things like multi-factor authentication using, say, Authy or Google Authenticator and stuff like that for SSO sign-ins. Plus, we also have a lot of integration that we'll see in the console, a long list of services that are going to be there for things like SageMaker, IoT Core, the Management Console, FSX, Workspaces. List kind of goes on. We'll see here in a little bit all of those different items, but want to make sure that for enterprise, right, you can leverage things like being able to integrate it with Office 365 or in Salesforce or like your Box.com authentication for anything that kind of supports AD authentication. I've said a lot already, Michael, so I'm going to stop real quickly there just to check to see if there's any questions from the audience before I go on to look at some of the infrastructure that sits behind this. You're on mute, Michael, just in case.
Thanks. Apologize there. Yeah. So I appreciate that. So yeah, you talk about SSO and you're talking about integration with native AWS apps, but can you talk a little bit more about how customers can use AWS Managed Active Directory for apps that are using LDAP-S?
Oh yeah, sure. So since this is just Microsoft AD on the background, you can use regular LDAP authentication against it, just authenticate 389 or whatever on there. Or if you're going to use LDAP-S, one thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to enable that after you deploy your environment. So you'll deploy this in our normal standard way. And then there's reason why you have to do it after the fact is you've got to choose what certificate you're actually going to use for that signing, right, for LDAP-S. And so you're going to have to basically do that portion after. But it's pretty easy. We'll see in the console how you're going to be able to register a certificate and enable LDAP-S as well. We won't actually run through it, but we'll show you where it is in the console. But that will allow you then, yes, to use your secure LDAP connections.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Rob. And back to you.
All right, great. Thanks. All right. So looking here, we've got kind of your topology that you could use or an infrastructure deployment that looks like for where you might leverage manage Microsoft AD with your on-premise environment. And we see here on the diagram that we've got a one-way or two-way trust that's connected via an AWS site-to-site VPN or AWS Direct Connect. And this is going to allow you to, instead of having necessarily migrate all your users into AWS or extend your Active Directory into AWS, you could still have all your users exist on your corporate data center AD environment there and just use the AWS Microsoft Managed AD essentially as a resource domain. We're going to deploy EC2 instances, your RDS instances, FSX file systems and such there, but you're not actually going to provision users there, just kind of resources that are going to get used by those users on-premise authentication and such. So that way they can just have it easily deployed into AWS, administer. I know in the past for me in working with some customers, some of their security teams have mild concerns about, extending or migrating AWS or AD into the cloud. This kind of gives them a way to not have to move users in, but can still leverage resources across. And since, like I mentioned, it's Microsoft AD, has that trust support for single sign-on, and make it highly available. You can take advantage of some of the features like seamless domain join. And then you can administer and set up those things like LDAP-S after you deployed your environment and use that within your AWS environment here as well. Speaking of things you're going to have to configure like that LDAP-S, we do have a shared responsibility model with our AWS Managed Microsoft AD as well. And so we have a list over here of some customer items that we kind of came up with. Of course, user management, you're going to want to know what users you're creating and how they're being created. So that's going to be on the customer in order to create your users, and then add them to groups and use those however you're going to use your normal environment, or use those in order to set up your access into the AWS console. Organizational unit management is going to be up for you as well, so you can decide where you want your user objects, groups, computers, and stuff. Especially helpful as you're getting into some of the GPO management to have those individual organization units, so you can apply a GPO per OU. You can still create group policy objects and use those like you would on your regular self-managed Active Directory with the AWS Managed. You can also leverage your own password policies, including fine-grained password policies, into your organizational units. That way you can have different password policies, say, for your accounts that are your AWS delegated administrators for AD, because you may want them to have a more complex password than, say, Jim that's just accessing a single EC2 instance or something. Additional security requirements, like I mentioned before, that LDAP-S configuration. One other one that we'll talk a little bit and show kind of in the console is also centralizing your logs with CloudWatch logs. And then, of course, your replication topology, something you're going to want to configure so you can make sure that machines in AWS are authenticating to your AWS domain controllers locally, and not, say, to a different area or region if you've got some multi-region deployments and stuff like that. Things that AWS is going to manage for you are kind of some of the ones that I always didn't like doing when I was having to administer AD boxes all the time. And that was making sure to remember patch management. Obviously, that's an incredibly important aspect of having anything Microsoft related or anything out there in your infrastructure, to make sure that it's constantly patched. With AWS Microsoft Managed AD, you don't have to worry about patch management. It will handle that for you. Because it does deploy in multiple availability zones. If there is one of the domain controllers, say, that lands on an EC2 instance that's having issues, we'll take care of the replacement for you, moving FSMA roles and such, that you don't have to worry about that administration on your side. And then, of course, we enable the automatic backups of the AD domain controllers as well for you, so that you don't have to actually, remember to back it up. Just make sure that those backups are there. And of course, test your backup strategy as always, because that's an important aspect of backup, is making sure that they work. Before I move forward into extending into Active Directory into AWS, are there any questions from the audience again, Michael?
Let's see here, Rob. One just dropped in. Can you join a Linux server to an AWS hosted AD domain? Not quite the topic that we're talking about today, but then also can you leverage group policies? But do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, certainly do. So you can definitely join a Linux box into your AD domain, whether it be self-managed or the AWS managed one. We have some great documentation online as well. We can try and put in there later on. It basically uses SSSD realms in order to join it into the domain. Group policies, though, on the other hand, don't actually work on Linux boxes because they don't know how to interpret them. So unfortunately, that aspect won't work. But at least if you want to be able to, say, allow your users to SSH into boxes using their AD credentials rather than the PEM certificate, or creating a local user for them, you can do that. And through some of the relevant configuration, you can deny access to groups or users and kind of limit that as well. So definitely something you can do.
All right, excellent, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So next, we're going to talk about another methodology that we have customers migrating or extending into AWS, and that's just extending Active Directory. And this is going to allow you to continue to use your self-managed Active Directory environment from on-premise and just connect it into AWS. So you say you have a local source of authentication for your users or your instances and such within AWS. You could, as we mentioned before, just continue to use that other usage pattern of no domain controllers in AWS, and just have your EC2 instances talk directly over Direct Connect to your on-premise environment. But if you have a high reliancy on authentication requests, you want to make sure they're speedy, they're available within AWS, depending, no matter if your Direct Connect or VPN goes down, you can actually deploy domain controllers then into AWS and have them talk back to your corporate data center and have that normal replication. Few caveats, of course, that you're going to have to do is make sure that you set up your sites and services, that you have your subnets going to local domain controllers. That way you can make sure that your authentications, like I said before, is not going from on-premise back to your AWS environment or vice versa. You can still create trust and everything and basically do anything that you would normally do with your Active Directory environment. You're just going to have it running on EC2 instances in AWS as well. And this will allow you to support workloads for things like Microsoft Exchange or like Link Server and stuff that we don't support currently on the managed AD. So this is a really great option for you if you're just kind of, wanting to also fully migrate out of your data center and say you've got your corporate infrastructure and you want to extend and you're slowly going to be moving over resources to AWS. When you're done, you really don't have any users to migrate per se. You can just, promote those or take those roles off your local ones and put them onto your AWS EC2 instance for your physical roles, and then demote those old domain controllers on premise and, complete your migration into AWS. So maybe you can save some money on closing down a data center or something as well. So this is one other usage pattern that we have. It's a good option for those just kind of looking to fully move out of or continue to operate in both as kind of a hybrid environment. All right. I'm going to go on to talk a little bit more about another option. And this one really isn't necessarily a migration way. It is kind of an extension and a way that you can leverage some AWS native services with your own self-managed AD a little bit easier for you to do so. Before I do that, though, Michael, I do want to just double check, make sure I'm not missing any questions or anything from the audience.
Let's see. No, we don't have any more right now.
Okay, great. Well, I will continue on here and go through our AWS AD Connector. So AD Connector is going to essentially function as a proxy for your Active Directory environment, but not for everything. What it's going to do is it's going to allow you to integrate into some AWS services, like being able to use a seamless domain join, or to be able to use Amazon Workspaces with your self-managed Active Directory environment. This could be a self-managed Active environment that's in AWS, or it could be your on-premise environment where you would just put an AD connector deployed inside of your account to talk to those domain controllers and stuff and allow you to have essentially easily drop down or integration for seamless domain join and some other services. This is going to allow you to basically have that role-based management, everything that you kind of want to have, still integrate multi-factor authentication like you can use typically with your AD, but just give you that ability to kind of use some of our native services easily with your own corporate kind of data center or self-managed Active Directory. The key component for this is going to be really the ability, like I mentioned, to integrating with AWS services. And this goes for your AD connector plus your Microsoft Managed AD as well. And we'll see a little bit more about this in our demo here coming up shortly. But primarily, what we're going to be looking at here is the ability with AD connector and your Microsoft Managed AD to leverage your services like Amazon FSx. If you're not familiar with what Amazon FSx is, first I'll go over. We have two options, Windows and Lustre. This is specifically for the Windows one. We'll then be able to set up a highly available file system for your end users to leverage. It's a large storage platform, but you can have it basically use your Windows AD credentials to then shut up the file shares and be able to access those file shares and such with it. Again, domain join is going to be another thing that I mentioned just really handy, as we talked about. Whether you're using Windows or Linux, you can use this AD domain join with your AD connector or Microsoft Managed AD to get your instances into your Active Directory. For me, that's just a really helpful thing. When I launch an instance, I know that I don't have to remember to decrypt the password and get access to that instance to log in. I know that it's going to automatically join my domain and my same user that I use to do everything else, to get into the console, to access other instances. I'm going to be able to just get into this box right away, as long as, of course, I've got permissions via the groups that are set and stuff, say when we do the deployment. It's going to allow you to integrate as well with Amazon RDS. So if you're using RDS for Microsoft SQL, you can provide access. This also does support Amazon RDS for a few other SQL engines as well. So take a look at that for our documentation. And then, of course, Amazon Workspaces that I talked about a little bit earlier. which is really just your virtual desktop environment. So if you have a fleet of remote users and you want to be able to get them access to things like desktops without having to send them hardware, and they can use kind of BYOD, you can use that and integrate that with your AD environment as well using these services. So really the integration piece, we're going to take a look in the console, what it looks like as far as deploying an Amazon workspace, what the FSX integration and some of the seamless domain join looks like here in just a little bit. But before we do,
Rob.
Yeah.
I just want to go ahead and jump in here. We did get another question asking about for the AD connector, does that require VPN?
So yes, you would want to use a VPN with it, right? Because what it's going to be doing is making connection back to your Active Directory environment to do the initial authentication of devices to your AD. After that, it's going to have to make calls back to your Active Directory directly from those EC2 instances. So it brokers essentially your initial connection to that, but then it's going to need a connection method to be able to continually authenticate and get updates and stuff like that from your Active Directory environment. So you're going to want a VPN or a direct connect. If you didn't have either of those, you would have to open up your on-premise domain controllers over the internet, which you definitely wouldn't want to do. So you would need a VPN or a direct connect in order to do that securely.
All right, great. Thanks. Back to you.
All right. One other thing that you can do, of course, is if you have your EC2 instances and you have your corporate data center that's out there and you have DNS for your environment and such, as you know, when you deploy an EC2 instance to AWS, it's going to have the normal .2 or the +2 DNS that it's going to look at. If you want it to leverage your corporate data center DNS, you can do some additional things with this in order to basically leverage a Route 53 resolver that is going to allow you to leverage that VPC +2 to forward into that Route 53 resolver for your on-premise. And based on the forwarding rules that you configure, is going to end up coming back and going over to your Active Directory environment on-premise. So this is mostly helpful in your migration efforts if you just want to continue to leverage the same DNS for now. So as you move things in, you don't have to worry about having like, so Split Horizons DNS is kind of what this is leveraged as. So you can kind of have that implementation where you're going to be able to resolve your on-premise resources back easily, leveraging, while it's not really AD, it's leveraging the Route 53 resolver. It's a way to help you to migrate your environments in. And so I just wanted to touch on it really quickly because it's an important kind of aspect to being able to resolve things within your domain when you're using Active Directory, because everything kind of relies on DNS and AD. So this is one way that you can have it leverage your corporate DNS or your existing DNS without having to modify all of your VPC configurations, like your DHCP option sets there to point to your corporate DNS or something. You can just use a resolver, still be able to leverage the internal resolvers and stuff like that within AWS and the scale there, while still being able to resolve that private domain for your company. All right, so that's all I have for presentation-wise, and I'm going to jump into a demo here to go over things. Before we do that, Michael, I just want to check to see if we missed any questions or anything like that from the audience. Otherwise, I will jump into kind of showing how this works within the console.
Let me see. So we do have a follow-up here. It's not, so Tom A242 is additionally, if I'm using SSO, does my instance of SSO, I'm assuming we're talking about AWS SSO, not third-party SSO here, have to be in the same region where my AD connector is set up.
Oh, so if you're going to be leveraging like AWS SSO, AD connectors are regional and really to the account, so you probably want to set it up that way. But really, we have some other ways that I'll kind of show within the console, especially if you're using like Microsoft Managed AD for AWS. It's a lot easier integration for you. So I'll kind of cover a little bit on that, but hopefully that helps to answer some.
Does. Thanks. Back to you.
Okay. All right, so we're going to take a look here into the console and see some of the different options that we have. We'll go over one that we didn't really cover today and one that we will cover next week. But we're going to mainly look at how we deploy AWS Managed Microsoft AD environment, how pretty simple it is to get a fully functional AD environment within your account. So if we see here, we have a few different options. We have our Managed AD, we have our Simple AD. Michael's going to provide a link to Simple AD. We didn't really cover it today because it's not truly Active Directory. It's a Apache basically Samba-like AD infrastructure that you can leverage for smaller organizations. It's a great offering to use if you just need something to give you centralized directory access and deployment of users and adding objects into that. But we didn't cover it today since we were primarily focused on our kind of native Active Directory environments and using AD Connector and such as well. So you can see we have AD Connector. And then we also have Amazon Cognito user pools that are down here. And so we didn't cover that at all today, but if you come back next week, same time, same place, we're doing an episode on Amazon Cognito and using it to secure your applications. So if you come back next week, we'll be able to cover a little bit more on those Amazon Cognito user pools that we have here. You can see a little bit about users can sign in with different features and supports in your apps. And next week, we're specifically going to cover on using it to secure your applications. So you can come see what it's like to set up a user pool and such there as well. For today, though, again, we're going to focus mainly on our AWS Managed Microsoft AD. So I'm going to pop back up here and we're going to deploy a AD environment. Once we click on that, we do have two options to choose from, whether we have standard or enterprise edition. And this really just depends on the size of your organization. Standard being the smaller, enterprise being the larger. We can see that we have a little bit of a cost difference and a number of object difference that goes with this. Enterprise, we support up to 500,000 objects. With standard, it's 30,000 objects. So just depending on if you're planning on migrating everything into AWS and you know that you need enterprise because you've got over that 30,000 objects, or if you're under that, you just know standard's fine. One thing I will note is that it is possible to upgrade later from standard to enterprise through support. But initially, if you want to make sure you're sized correctly, you can choose enterprise. Another key aspect to enterprise is going to be in order to be able to do your kind of multi-region kind of deployments and stuff, you're going to need enterprise edition with this. So if you have that in mind when you're deploying, you're probably going to take that into account. For today, it's literally me and like 3 computers that are going to exist in this domain. So when we deploy, I'm going to deploy a standard edition one just to be frugal and make sure I save cost in my demo. So I'm going to select this standard edition over here over the enterprise edition, just because, like I said, it's just a few users that are going to be deployed in there. Once we check standard, we're going to give it a name. I'm just going to name it AWS Supports You.demo.local so that it's just a little local domain. Give it a NetBIOS name of demo, little demo directory description. So nice and easy there. And then you're just going to set your admin password. This admin password is going to be the one that gives you access to your environment to begin with. So make sure to choose a secure password. It says 8 to 64 characters. 64 might be a little excessive, but in reality, users shouldn't typically be using this account too much. You should choose a nice long password, store it in a vault, make sure that it's rotated routinely so that you can keep that account secure. And one thing that's kind of nice is if you're like me, occasionally I will set up test environments and then come back to them a week later and forget what I set the password to because I didn't document and listen to what I preach. Within the console, there's easy integration to be able to reset users' passwords within your Microsoft managed AD environment with AWS. So if you forget it, you can reset it within the console nice and easily. You can also reset other users. There's some other console integration that we'll show here as well after we deploy this. That'll make it kind of easy for you to manage. Next, as I mentioned, we're going to have to choose what network we're going to deploy it into. As I mentioned, if you're using this as a resource domain that you're just going to integrate a trust with, or you just want to be able to share this with other accounts, maybe you have the model where you're going to have a shared services VPC. And so you might deploy this AD environment into your shared services VPC. So I'm just going to choose this one because it's my shared services one. And I'm going to choose 2 different subnets because we want to deploy this in 2 different AZs. When we deploy our default standard for AWS Microsoft Managed AD, it's going to be 2 domain controllers in 2 different subnets. And that's going to make sure that we have some extra availability there, right, for us. If we try to, say, deploy this into the same one, it's going to yell at us here that we'll see here. As I'm going to switch these from US East 1B to both B and US 1F. But we definitely don't want to do that. It won't let us do that. It will yell at you if it says if you don't know which ones you actually want to, just let us choose. Say you only had one subnet in that VPC, you can see we can just create another new subnet as well. And that will allow us to create that. I'm going to click next. We've got a little overview here of what we would be deploying, where we would next just click Create Directory. But it does take a little bit of time for us to deploy, so I'm going to click Cancel here because magically I already have this domain deployed as well. And so we'll use one that I already have deployed rather than waiting the 15 minutes or so that it takes for this to deploy. Because it is launching 2 instances, like I mentioned, setting up Windows and setting up Active Directory, configuring your domain for you, and everything. So it takes a little bit of time. So I already have one kind of pre-deployed that we're going to take a look at here. And we'll see that I have my directory deployed, give it the same name. It is Microsoft AD. I'm just using standard, given my demo, my AWS Supports You demo directory. We can see the VPC configuration and everything like that we have there, subnets that I deployed it into, the DNS addresses. These are going to be important, especially as you're going to add machines in your domain and stuff. You probably need the DNS servers for your AD controllers because if you're a Microsoft person, you know everything in Active Directory relies on DNS. So definitely can be an important component for you to have. So we can kind of jump around and look at a few different features that exist within the console here, one of them being this trust relationship side, where you can easily configure a trust here. What you're going to have, of course, is a connection back to your other domain. Plus, you're going to have to establish the trust or start the trust on your domain that you're connecting to or your forest that you're connecting to. And then you'll come into the console, choose Add Trust Relationship, and give it that configuration. As I mentioned before, we can scale and share our directory. So you can actually take this directory now that you've got it created and share it with another account. I don't have any shared with this account, so that's why I don't have any listed. But I could come in, since I don't have any, I can say I'm going to share this, put in an account number, give it a note that says, here's the reason why I'm sharing this with you, and then actually share my Active Directory with another account for some resource sharing. We've got some maintenance options that we can put into here. We'll include a link to some of the different things that are there for monitoring within directory. But as I mentioned before, we do the patching, we do rotation. If there's issues with an instance, something becomes unhealthy, we monitor all that and we make those changes for you. If you want to get a notification of that and be able to kind of just know that something's going on your Active Directory environment, you can click Create Notification and be able to get notifications of that information as well as it happens within your domain. We'll also see that we have snapshots, and that just shows that we've got our daily snapshot that was completed. That's an automatic snapshot in order to get us, that. But yeah, that just relies on SNS as well. I did want to point that out. So if you're getting directory monitoring, it will use SNS notifications. So you'll have to put in an email address for it to get configured into. So those are backups. We've also got below here schema extensions. So if you needed to update your schema because you've got a custom application that's using for specific attributes in your AD environment, you can actually extend your AD schema. Do it nice and easily here. All you have is your LDIF file of your schema, and then you'll click Upload and Update Schema, choose your LDIF file, and then update that into your Active Directory infrastructure. And that will allow you to deploy things. So you have like a custom attribute 15 that you need to have for whatever information that your app uses. All right. So I mentioned before, we got the trust relationships. You can set those up nice and easily through the console. If you've set them up in Microsoft AD before, it's still pretty easy to do within there as long as you've got connectivity. But connectivity is going to be that main thing. You really have to make sure that you can resolve DNS for both of those that you can actually set up and use, say, if you're going to migrate users. If you're going to use like Active Directory migration tool in order to do that, you're going to need to have that trust established so that you can actually resolve and see your source domain and your target domain for that, so that you can migrate users across into, say, if you're doing a full migration from your own AD into our AWS Microsoft Managed AD offering. So establish that trust here, and then you can still deploy and use in your Active Directory users' computers. Like you normally use to see users, you can still use AD to migrate users over and get them into your new domain. So that's going to be kind of the tools that you'll still continue to use, just like you would if you were administering your regular on-premise environment or your self-managed EC2 run. You could still use AD users' computers. You'll still see sites and services and stuff like that, have trusts and stuff that you can look at. We'll quickly take a look at that here in the actual EC2 instance itself. Here to cover. So we talked briefly about LDAP-S before, right? And so here within the console, as you can see, you'll have to register your certificate and then be able to enable, once it's registered, then you'll be able to enable LDAP-S in order to use that. So you'll just have this here where once you actually have the certificate registered, that enabled button will become available for you to enable. As it is right now, since we have no certificate, you can't actually enable LDAP-S, of course. So I know I've been talking a lot, Michael. I just want to see if I missed any questions at all from the audience while I've been going through kind of some of these different components, because I know there's a lot to it.
All right, Rob. Yeah, we really prefer all of the overview that you've been giving us, as well as the dive on how to enable and do all of these things for the AWS Managed AD and Directory Services. So we don't have any questions right now. I've reached out to the audience asking for any more comments or questions. So I'll just turn it back over to you.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Okay. So another component that we can see here on the screen as well is log forwarding. So I mentioned for some compliance notification reasons and stuff, you may have to, well, you're definitely going to want to enable log forwarding. So if you're like me and you've managed Microsoft AD environments for a while in the past, you probably use some tool to centralize your domain controller logs to hopefully another location and not just relying those on their Active Directory domain controllers themselves. In the past, I've used different syslog agents to collect that and aggregate it to a central location. So that in case of a security incident on one of your AD domain controllers, if you have a bad actor that gets actual access to things, we want to make sure that we have that log forwarding enabled. And this is going to make sure that that gets it off the domain controller. So even if someone were to come in, they were to get access to, say, worst case, your admin account, they wouldn't be able to go through necessarily clean up all the logs, because those would be dumped out to different resource. So instead of having to administer and use, say, a syslog agent on the instance, and then have your own managed syslog server that's going to aggregate all those logs for domain controllers, we've enabled it to be easy to integrate with CloudWatch logs. And so you can enable CloudWatch logs and do log forwarding here, where you're just going to configure in your Microsoft Managed AD what log group you want to send those to. And that will help you to then have those logs for later review in case, someone deletes something for some odd reason from the actual local domain controllers. You can see and also, generate events and stuff on those CloudWatch logs. So if you want to monitor those for specific, say, number of failed login attempts or something like that, get notifications through CloudWatch for them, you can use some integration there as well. We also see that we've got multi-factor authentication. So if you've got an existing Radius deployment that you're using that has your MFA devices and stuff leveraged, so I've used Duo's authentication before with it, you can leverage this to kind of integrate and have your MFA still be able to have that second factor of authentication, which is a really key component to leveraging things. So we talked about integration with AWS services. So I definitely want to cover that, because it's kind of one of the key features that we have that makes it really easy to do with our AWS Managed AD. And that's going to be to give you easy access into the AWS Management Console and some other services here. So as we go down, we can see we've got a list of some of the AWS apps and services that are available for users in this directory, right? And you can enable and disable these depending on where you are in the console. You'll have to do this inside of the actual service, or some of them you can enable pretty easily from within here. Specifically, we're going to look at AWS Management Console. This is going to allow you to have that single sign-on with your users to use their AD credentials in order to log into their AWS Management Console. So the same accounts they use to log into their desktops or into EC2 instances, they can log into their AWS console to administer that environment there. You can see once we would enable it, we have URLs to application over on the right-hand side. And so those would be where your user would go to try and authenticate into the account, or say the single sign-on if they're using SSO, where that start point was. One really nice thing about SSO is if you have multiple accounts, one, being able to leverage the same username and password, right, without having to set up a bunch of different IAM users, which you should use roles instead anyway. But with SSO, when a user signs in, they don't necessarily have to remember what account they're trying to sign into specifically. Once they actually log in, whatever accounts they have access to, it will give them kind of a little drop down, or not drop down, but kind of a window of the accounts they can choose and what roles they have access to that have been mapped to your identity provider and stuff. And that's going to allow them just really easy access into the accounts to be able to manage and administer overall. SSO. If you're not using SSO, it's definitely a handy thing to be able to use. Once we have it enabled here, I'm going to click on enable, and then I'll go back up and refresh my window here because it shows disabled still. We can see that it's now enabled. Once I've enabled it, that will allow me then below here to actually map users or groups within my Active Directory environment to IAM roles. So you're going to have to create these IAM roles within IAM that you're going to use to then correlate back to your Active Directory groups. So important to come up with the naming contents to make it easy for you to know which ones are going to be used for your essentially directory services integration. For my groups in AD, I just tag them all AWS dash. Like this one is EC2 read only. And then I have one that's just kind of not named in that context of console admin access. But through this, because I have those users available in Active Directory, I could then map these to these roles here. So when those users log in, they're assigned the permissions they're supposed to have within the account, whether it be read only or whether they're supposed to be an admin in the account. And we can do this from using all the users within our AD environment. So we're going to go take a look at what users I have in AD. And as I mentioned before, it's literally just me, one lonely account that's there. But I'll still show you what that looks like and how we map into one of our IAM roles so that users can get in here. And so this also will be useful for you. So here we've got our AWS Managed AD. We can see here that, sorry, it's a little bit small, I think, today, but we can see that we've got the domain, we've got our computers, our groups, our users. And if I go underneath our users, we can see that I have Rob and just my admin user that exists in here. But I also have some groups that I've created for console admins and for EC2 read only. And these are going to allow us to then, instead of using users, because it's going to be much easier and much more scalable if you use groups in AD to assign those to roles rather than individual users. I use groups to just throw my users in to say, hey, you're going to get console admin access. So you go into this group and then I can leverage that. Just real quickly here, you can see default first site. This is just our traditional. We can see we have our 2 domain controllers that get deployed in the account. Just wanted to show you that it still looks like you would if you had your regular AD environment, but this is the AWS Managed AD. So if I'm going to pick my console admin role that I want to give myself access to because I'd like to be able to log in here instead of as an IAM user, I can choose find by user or find by group. And like I mentioned, it can be much more scalable to use groups for everything. And I can go ahead and type in AWS. I'm going to add a little dash at the end because that'll scope it down. And I can say, okay, I'm going to give myself access to this AWS console admin role to this group so that when I log in with my AD user to the AWS console, I will have access as an admin in here. So you can do this for all your other users. So all you have to do is basically predefine these groups and access. And then as you get new people in, as you're doing your provisioning of your users, just make sure they get added to those groups in AD rather than having to worry about, creating users in IAM and then having those users in AD separately and such. Again, been talking a lot, Michael, so just going to take a break real quickly to see if there's any questions from the audience about this so far.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions here. First one I'm going to ask is on setting up trust. Can you talk about setting up maybe the differences between a one-way trust versus a two-way trust, what that might look like when working with AWS?
Yeah. So it's going to depend, right? You can either just do a one-way trust where you're going to allow the users from on-premise to authenticate. So you just want to be able to get them to get access to resources, but you don't want to allow, say, users from AWS to authenticate to your corporate domain. That would just be a one-way, right? And that would just allow you to be able to log into those things in AWS, but not allow things from AWS essentially to log into your corporate AD. So it's going to be kind of your delineation and difference on where you're going to want to decide whether you want a one-way or a two-way trust. It's just what do you want to allow access where. Setup's going to be fairly much the same. Just as you're deploying that trust, you're going to choose whether you can do a one-way or a two-way. You can also have to choose if it's transitive or not transitive as well. And that just basically means that like a domain trusts another domain as you set those up. So those are just kind of different things that you're going to have to assess out necessarily with your security team to understand what they're comfortable with, and probably the rest of your AD team to understand what's really needed for you in order to have what you need working within AWS.
All right, thanks. I do have another question or two, but I'll save that until at the maybe later after your
Okay.
presentation.
Great. So real quickly, I'm just going to show you once again, once we have our domain set up, we have our users deployed and everything. I already have one instance, but I'm just going to show you real quickly. If we were going to launch an EC2 instance into that domain, we just select our domain as normal. Obviously, you can automate this through the CLI. But we have these two options here, as we can see through domain join directory and then an IAM role. And so those are two things that you're going to have to set when you're launching your instance in order to have a domain join when it comes up. So I'm going to choose my domain here. We can see it's the same name. Then we have to choose an IAM role. The reasons why we need an IAM role for this instance is because we have to allow it access to interact essentially with our AD environment and use SSM on it as well to kind of deploy and make sure that we actually get joined into the domain. So that's why we have to select those two. As we can see here, there's a note underneath that says for domain join to succeed, select an IAM role that has the AWS managed policy, AWS systems core, and Amazon SSM directory services attached to it. Pretty easy to set that up and get it ready for you to be able to use. I just used an existing role that I had for SSM and just tacked on the Amazon SSM directory services access. But that's just going to give us a quick, nice, easy way to domain join an instance into your Active Directory environment. If you're using AD Connector, you'll still see a domain drop down as well. But if we were to go through here and click launch, I would end up with an instance that's domain joined for me, and I can just log in with my AD user that would have access to this if it's just everyone's allowed to log into the machine or not. We'll look at a few other overall services that we can integrate with as well. But really domain joins, it's a really nice time saver on your administrators from having to add instances and stuff, right? So it's just going to save you some time. So launching into workspaces, again, you're just going to see the demo of your directory being available. Choose your subnets for your workspace. If you're not familiar, Amazon Workspaces requires two subnets in the background because it tries to make your workspace highly available. So it wants to load it with basically two VPCs attached, or two AZs attached to it in a single VPC, just for availability. This is just going to allow you to be able to deploy a workspace really quickly and easily. But one thing I want to cover about the nice thing of leveraging Microsoft Managed AD with our workspaces here when this comes up is that we have provisioning of users built into the console there. So this could also be automated, but say you have your AWS Microsoft Managed AD environment deployed and you want to start using workspaces. Right now, if you don't have it integrated, you have to basically come up with like a password reset or a password notification system of your own for when your workspace is kind of completed. With this, say if you've got users and you need to add new users to your directory, you can do that right within the console by selecting a username, first name, last name, email. And then when you create that user and you create this workspace, they will get an automatic notification that says, hey, your workspace is ready. Here, you can come set your AD password for you, and you can go in and they can go in and set their AD password and have kind of a nice seamless deployment. If you have users already in Active Directory, you can actually leverage that too and just have it search into Active Directory for your user and assign a workspace to that as well. So it's going to make it very simple. So like if I were to come in here and search for Rob, because that's my one user that I have in there, I would see that I have Rob here and I can just click and I can deploy an Amazon workspace just through here. I'll continue to use my same username and password that I have for this Active Directory domain and be able to access this workspace once I get the notification that says, hey, your workspace is ready to be used without having to have a separate user or anything like that or a separate domain. So very handy to be able to leverage the Microsoft Managed AD with workspaces just in that workflow. Again, you can integrate into Amazon FSx as well. When you go to create a file system, you will have the option to choose the domain that you want to add this into, and then you'll be able to have these. You can create like continuously available shares in FSx that'll be highly available for your users to access using the same AD credentials that they normally use. So if you do want some more information on creating a trust relationship and try and look and see what you're going to do, we do have some documentation that we're going to include here in the chat as well for covering how to create a trust relationship, how to start configuring it. It does also have some information on like why you need a one-way or a two-way as well. So if you take a look through there, it'll kind of more hopefully define, what your strategy should be when you're actually leveraging this into AWS. We'll also include some documentation on how to enable the AWS Management Console. Pretty simple, pretty easy to do, but it does have just a couple steps in order to do it. So wanted to make sure you all had this documentation available so that you can leverage it quickly and easily moving forward. So that's all I have for our demo today, Michael. So just check back in with you and see if there's any questions here that we have for the last few minutes.
I do. I've got one additional one that I'd like to ask, and I'll be watching for maybe any others here in the last couple of minutes. But are there any other recommended things that you would suggest to do with, say, my managed AD to enhance the security?
So we kind of talked a little bit about that, but mostly going to be the CloudWatch logs, just so you make sure you have a aggregated, offloaded logging for your AD domain controllers. That's just standard best practice for Microsoft AD. One other component that you can have is when you deploy Microsoft Managed AD, it deploys a set of security groups that allow access to your accounts that you can leverage it. I do recommend taking a look at those and just potentially modifying them just to make them more personalized to your network use case and stuff like that, whether you're only going to allow certain security groups access within VPC or certain CIDR ranges and stuff. You can look through those security groups and really just don't use those security groups for anything else. You could assign those to other EC2 instances, right? But they should only be used for the purpose that they were designed to be used for. So I would avoid leveraging for other things and just really label them and verify them.
All right, thanks, Rob. I appreciate all you've done today in walking us through how to be able to extend and migrate your Active Directory to AWS and how easily it integrates with a number of AWS services such as Amazon Workspaces and Amazon FSx. So if there's any questions that we did not answer for you, please feel free to post your questions on forums.aws.amazon.com. I've also just dropped a link in there that our moderators have created that you can use to register and see upcoming episodes that we will be having. And that once you register, it will notify you, allow you to put that into your calendar so you're sure to join us and not miss any episodes. And also feel free to email us any feedback at AWS Supports You at Amazon.com. Thank you very much for joining us at AWS Supports You, and happy cloud computing.
Happy cloud computing all.